Have you ever wondered what it's like to work in law enforcement? Here on Behind the Star, we share stories about the Orange County Sheriff's Office, Central Florida's largest law enforcement agency. From forensics to dispatch to the deputies on patrol, we'll talk to the brave men and women who protect our community. This is Behind the Star, the official podcast of the Orange County Sheriff's Office. Welcome to Behind the Star, the official podcast of the Orange County Sheriff's Office. My name is Jon Busdeker, your host here at Behind the Star, and I got a fascinating podcast for you today. We're talking cold cases, and we're specifically talking about a cold case that happened here in Orange County 25 years ago. I have Detective Brian Savelli and Corporal Dave Nutting. Welcome to Behind the Star.
Thank you.
All right, Corporal.
Thank you.
And I want to get right into this. There was a murder back in 1996. A man was stabbed at a convenience store, and it went unsolved for 25 years. And so I want to do a deep dive into this because we put some video up, but it was kind of an overview of the case. And I wanted to talk to the detectives who helped solve this. And so, Detective Savelli, why don't you sort of start this off? What happened back in 1996? Tell us all about it.
Sure. So Terrence Paquette, I'll just refer to him as Terry, was the store manager for the Lil Champ at Claricona Coe and 441.
And this is kind of in northwest Orange County, if you're not familiar where that is.
That is correct. And he was opening the store that day. He was the manager. So as you could imagine, your morning duties entail totaling the cash register, brewing coffee, and just going about your opening duties. And that's what he was doing on February 3rd of 1996. And we know that just from going back and looking at the crime scene photos, that he was in his morning stages of opening the store. And so anyways, the sheriff's office responded to a call for service at the location. A couple people had noticed that the door was locked and that the lights were off, but Terry's car was there. And these people that noticed that were people that drove by the store every day, people that picked up the cash for the armored car service. And so they kind of knew something just wasn't right, and so they called the sheriff's office, and that's how we got involved.
Yeah, you think about somebody who, their normal routine is to maybe stop at this convenience store, maybe grab a lotto ticket, grab a coffee, and it might seem odd that on this particular day it was locked when normally it's open.
Yeah, that's correct. And so even some of the witnesses that drove by on a daily basis even were so observant that they saw that the lights were off inside, and that kind of struck them as odd because typically at that time in the morning the lights are on. Because like we were just saying, Terry was in the middle of opening the store, and so you would need the light on. The lights wouldn't be off. And so just little things like that struck people as odd, and that's what kind of prompted them to call the sheriff's office.
And so what happened next? Did the sheriff's deputies showed up and tried to get in, or what happened next?
Yeah, so deputies responded, and on scene they met with two armored truck drivers that were there to pick up the cash deposit. And they also were alarmed that the door was locked, but deputies noticed on the lock assembly on the exterior of the door there was blood. And so now you factor in the fact that these people are calling in this odd behavior, that the lights are off, that Terry's car is there, and now the deputies get there and see blood. And they went from there. And I think a short time later they were trying to figure out how to get inside the business. Back then they were able to call inside, so they called inside. There was no answer. They even called Terry's personal phone at his apartment to see if he was home, maybe overslept, went back and grabbed something, but there was no answer there.
Yeah, and he lived nearby. He didn't live too far from this convenience store.
Yeah, I think it was about a quarter mile.
Correct.
Yeah, about a quarter mile, maybe a half mile at most. So, they didn't get no answer inside the business. They didn't get any answer at the apartment. And so, ironically, another store employee that closed the night before on the 2nd of February by the name of Fred Arnett, he lived in the apartments behind, and he actually had a softball game that Saturday morning with his fiance at the time, who he ended up marrying. And he stopped by and saw the activity and made contact with the detectives. And he provided his key so they could get access. And you got to imagine it's a Saturday morning, about 7 o'clock. And so now, if we didn't have Fred show up with a key, it could have been another couple hours just by the time you get a key holder to respond. So the fact that Fred came was, I could imagine, a huge help to them. So they were able to unlock the door with Fred's keys, and they went in and they found Terry brutally murdered in the bathroom.
Yeah, and Corporal Nutting, can you describe kind of what the deputies found? And we know this because we have lots and lots of evidence photos since then. And I'm saying, can you just sort of describe what happened?
Correct. So Detective Savelli picked this case up, searching through some of our archives, and noticed that there was blood that appeared to be from the suspect dripping throughout the store. So clearly, the way the blood was positioned throughout the store made it appear that during this attack that the suspect injured him or herself.
And maybe can you describe kind of what happened? So when these 2 deputies or 3 deputies or however many deputies went into the store, what did they find? Where did they find Terry?
So ironically enough, the deputy who ended up becoming the lead crime scene detective was on her way to work and heard the call go out. And she was right up the street. It was near Orange Blossom Trail and Clarkona Coe Road up on the northwest side of Orange County. So they go, she pulls in, the key holder shows up, they go in and they find Terry in the bathroom. It was a horrific crime scene, stabbed over 70 times. Just really, really horrific. And so the crime scene tech ended up just staying there because she was going to have to work the scene. And obviously, a homicide detective showed up, and then the lead detective, Detective Weir, worked this case. They held the store for 2 straight weeks, which is very uncommon, especially in this day and age, because they were employing some techniques back then that today take a very short period of time, but back then were very time-consuming.
Yeah, and Detective Savelli, when they say held the store, that means nobody in and out except for deputies and detectives.
Oh, that's exactly what that means. And in fact, there was actually a deputy there overnight at all times. So when the crime scene investigators and the detectives were done for the day at 5, 6, 7 o'clock, whenever they got done, there was a deputy on scene until they returned the next morning.
So they find Terry. He's stabbed multiple times in the bathroom. There's blood everywhere. I mean, what else did the detectives find during those sort of 2 weeks that they're checking out the store?
Well, you could imagine what they would find in the 2 weeks. Of course, there was blood that showed movement all throughout the scene. But aside from just physical evidence on scene, you kind of dive into the victimology of the case and try to learn who your victim is and what he or she was doing, what they were doing in their personal life aside, even though they worked for the Lil Champ. You try to look beyond that and see what they were doing in their personal life that could overlap.
So maybe go on from there. I mean, who was Terry? I mean, what did they find out about Terry when they started looking into who he was?
Yeah, Terry was born in New Hampshire, and he moved down here, and he was a single guy living on his own. And had a small group of friends that he would socialize, drink with, it, stuff that you could imagine I believe he was 31 at the time, what a 31-year-old would do. But he had a small group of friends that he would occasionally go to Disney, go to dinner, have drinks with. And so I think the focus of the investigation started there. When you think of somebody that stabbed so many times, you think of somebody that's close to them, that's personal. And so I think that's where the detective started at that point.
And I'm going to say this because I think it's important to the case, especially back in the 90s, because, things have changed a little bit since then. But Terry at the time, Terry was gay.
Yes, and openly so.
Yeah, and openly gay. And in the 90s, it was different then. And so I'm sure the detectives at the time maybe thought that was part of the case. And maybe it still is today, but I'm sure that was maybe part of their focus when they were looking into maybe who did this.
Yeah, and so that's where the focus was on his small group of friends, and Terry was a gay guy in the 90s, and so were a lot of his friends. Mm-hmm. They all had the same social, network. Yeah,
and so when the detectives start looking into all this, did they have any idea maybe who might have done this at the time, or did they have any leads? Did they have anything? Because also, and we should mention, there was some money stolen as well.
Yeah, there was some money stolen from the Lil Champ. It appeared that the cash deposit was gone, and some money that was maybe left there from the overnight cash register was gone as well. But I think what the focus of the detectives back then was on the friends who he socialized with, if he was dating anybody at the time, and I think that just stemmed from once you realize somebody stabbed so many times, that's kind of where you start.
Maybe Corporal Nutting, explain that. Why does it matter that somebody stabbed 73 times compared to 5? Either one's probably going to kill somebody, so why does it matter that 73 times is a big deal?
Well, you hear the term overkill. and a lot of the shows that you watch on Investigation Discovery or any of these other true crime. And I think at this point, it's pretty widely known and accepted, and even amongst enthusiasts, like, hey, immediately, this looks really strange. Like, why do you stab somebody 73 times or over and over like that? It was certainly unnecessary. So it was puzzling back then. Like, was this a robbery turned murder, or was this a murder and the money was there as a matter of convenience? So I think the detectives originally struggled with that too, because it was very apparent that he was attacked and murdered before the store opened. So that was one of the things that we really tried to drill down on in this investigation, is exactly when he was killed. Because the assumption has always been that he was murdered prior to opening. And we were able to clarify some of that stuff by re-interviewing witnesses. Actually, Detective Savelli and I went up to Massachusetts and interviewed a clerk who was training with him, or who had previously trained with him. And he was able to walk us through the crime scene photos, see the paperwork that was on the counter. I mean, we even got down, and this is what a lot of people don't realize, is how simple the case sounds. Like, oh, the guy cut himself, we get his DNA, and then we go make the arrest, have a great day. But we really, we traveled out of town, out of state in this case, communicated with I think it was Sanyo, the cash register people, because we noticed the keys in the crime scene photos were in particular positions, and we had to find out what those positions meant. Well, those cash registers were old in 1996, so they've been long discontinued. But the people at the cash register manufacturers were helpful in explaining when those keys are in those positions, that's indicative of the clerk running reports. So, and there's timestamps on the report, so we could see one cash register had the cash tape on the counter, and the other one appeared to be in the middle of opening or running the report. So, we were able to, I think, pretty comfortably to figure out within a few minutes when this attack occurred.
I want to get to all that, but I want to go back real quick. And so these 2 weeks go by. They search the store. They're trying to figure out maybe who did this. I don't know if they had a suspect or not, or a person of interest. But this was back in 1996. What happened? I mean, why did the case go cold, and how come they couldn't figure it out at the time? And I'm not trying to put anybody down on that either. I know that's how things happen sometimes. So tell me what happened in 1996.
So in 1996, the detectives were limited by technology. DNA was an emerging technology at the time. Fingerprints were, this was pre-AFIS. Now we have a system we can just throw the prints in and run against any known offenders. And eventually those systems did come online, but still never hit to CODIS or AFIS.
And those are both databases with DNA and blood and all that.
Correct.
Okay.
So the offender back then had no offenses on their record that would have required them to have their DNA uploaded into CODIS. Certainly, if somebody is arrested for like a sexual battery or murder, attempted murder, and some other serious qualifying offenses, they would get their DNA, and it would be a quick hit. They would have got something immediately. But back then, those technologies didn't exist, so it was a matter of going out and getting out, and knocking on doors, and trying to solve it what you might consider the good old-fashioned way. Mm-hmm. And this particular defendant was not even in the case file. It wasn't part of the circle of friends. It wasn't part of the group. And eventually, after the evidence was collected and analyzed and stored, people were interviewed, and the case just kind of stalled. Yeah. It was picked up again later. I think Brian was that
in 2003. It was picked up.
Right. And
any particular reason, or just over years go by, somebody sees it, says, hey, like maybe we have better technology now, maybe we can figure this thing out.
Yeah, so to touch on the technology, I think back in the 90s, before what you mentioned was AFIS,
What is that? What is? Do you know what AFIS stands
It's the
for?
I believe it's the automatic fingerprint identification system that's ran through the FBI.
Okay.
And but back in the 90s, they were able to compare fingerprints, but they were only able to directly compare it. So, for instance, if everybody in this room, it's like a game of Clue, right? If I'm found murdered and the detectives come in and say, well, here's a murder weapon, and John and Corporal Nutting was the last ones to see Brian, and here's a murder weapon, well, then they could go back and say, I need John's fingerprints and I need Corporal Nutting's fingerprints, and then they can compare that. But without directly comparing it, the fingerprints were essentially no good.
Yeah, so you need to at least have the person there.
Yeah, you need a clue before you
Okay.
can get that forensic evidence. And so back then, they tried that. They started out with getting fingerprints from the known people, but then in 2003 when CODIS came up, which is another database run by the FBI, and that's the same thing as AFIS, but with DNA, then that's why it was picked up, because now they went back and they got these people's DNA standards to compare to the evidence.
But you gotta be in that system for it to get a match.
Yeah. So going back when you asked what the hurdles were with technology, imagine going into a Lil Champ now and there's probably 5 to 6 cameras if there's even a Lil Champ around. But let's say for like Wawa, there's probably 18 cameras at a Wawa.
At least.
Take into account at the gas pumps. There was no cameras in the Lil Champ, but there was a trap camera. And I wasn't around for a trap camera.
What is that? What's a trap camera?
Yeah, I'll let Corporal Nutting explain that.
So back in the day, I started my career in 1989, and we did have some surveillance, but it was very in its infancy. So what a trap camera would do would be a still camera, like a 35 millimeter camera, and what looked like a speaker box behind the clerk's head. And there was one special set of currency in the cash register. When that currency was pulled out,
Interesting.
it would activate a switch that would take a bunch of still photographs of the perpetrator.
Okay, that's interesting.
So what an interesting fact was that this trap camera was never activated. Even though all the cash was missing, that was the only cash left in the store.
Interesting.
So
So you knew somebody had to understand that was there, or know that's how you activate it.
that's a very knowing what we know now and kind of looking back, that was always a consideration. Could they have just overlooked that because it was just a little bit of cash? Maybe they didn't look in the cash, or if they did, or they might have had some inside knowledge. I better not pull that because as soon as I pull it, it's going to activate the trap camera and my image could potentially be caught. So one way or the other, that camera was never activated.
Yeah.
So there was no photo or video surveillance.
So then you would have
available.
to take the stuff from the trap camera. You'd have to take the film, right, and go get it developed.
Right.
Huh. So Detective Savelli, how did you end up, and Corporal Nutting as well, how did you end up getting this case? I mean, now it's 20, 25 years later. How did you just see this and you were interested in it, or how did you get it?
Well, I started looking. All the media came out about genetic genealogy. I guess it was back in 2018, maybe. I don't know the time frame, but of course everyone heard about the Golden State Killer out west, and I was up in homicide at the time, and I was just thinking, like, all these cold cases, there has to be at least one that there was some kind of blood or DNA evidence that we could do this. And for an agency our size with as many murders as we get a year, I was just thinking there had to be one. So I was just looking through the cases, and I found I had known Detective Cameron Weir from before I was even a cop. And so I was just looking through his cases, and I found this one, and I saw that Terry was stabbed, like we said, over 70 times. And so I was just thinking, if somebody was stabbed 70 times, the bad guy more than likely probably injured himself. And so there's probably an unknown contributor there.
Yeah. So when you start looking at this case, both of you, like where do you go? Because I'm sure you look at all the evidence, photos, all the interviews, all that, and you say, all right, well, this is what they had done back in the 90s and the early 2000s. Like, where do you sort of pick up from there and say, all right, well, I'm going to go here and look, and like, how can you solve this case if all these people before you couldn't?
Well, it kind of came down to us having the same limitations that the original detectives did. So we had a big meeting downstairs. I say downstairs in our forensics area, where homicide's upstairs, forensics is downstairs. Going over crime scene photos, seeing what evidence we could potentially reprocess, the fingerprint technology, how could that improve? And the fingerprints, there was a lot of fingerprints taken in this case, and they were not organized great. So our fingerprint analysts have been working still to this day to process all these fingerprints. It's not just the way they're labeled. You can imagine. Don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but it's well over 100 fingerprints, and they're labeled. You want to find out, hey, where exactly did this come from? Sometimes, find how fingerprint cards correspond to where they're at in the crime scene. Are they photographed? It's a lot more cumbersome than you think it would be, especially after 25 years of sitting in a box somewhere.
Yeah.
So we kind of leveraged our advancements in those technologies, and the genetic genealogy. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement got involved after Brian presented the case, and Vanessa Nylander, our forensic biologist downstairs, who now supervises our entire forensic biology section, worked with FDLE, and then at that point we were just had to sit back and wait. And Brian had a lot of correspondence with the FDLE and FDLE with the lab to do the genealogy.
Brian, maybe you can explain genetic genealogy for pretend that I'm like a first grader. Explain it to me in sort of layman's terms. What is this, and how can this help solve cases?
Basically, it's building a family tree on the DNA that we have, and that's really all it is. Is no different than when you built the family tree in school, if you ever did one. But I obviously FDLE would disagree with me that it's not that easy.
No, it's not that easy.
Yeah.
But
basically that's basically what it is.
There was blood left at the scene in the Lil Champ, and you could determine, okay, we know this is Terry's blood, and so that's all ruled out. And then there's other blood that's not Terry's blood, but you don't know whose blood it is, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And so, even going back, and when we talked about the limitations, we even knew that back then in the 90s that there was different blood. Just because, of course, with us having Terry as a victim, we had his DNA, of course. And so we were able to determine that there was other blood there.
And so that's saved somewhere and saved in our evidence or somewhere that blood is saved, because hopefully in the future one day they can use that to determine the suspect or the killer. And so I assume we took that blood and we sent it to the FDLE, and how did that work?
Well, we back in the 90s?
No, now.
Oh, so now, yeah. So it's not what you think, sending blood. You're sending little tubes that are nothing more than extracts, and they're saved in a freezer. And so when you think of we're sending blood, you think we're sending that's not really the case. You're really sending the scientific data behind the blood off, not really the blood itself.
Okay. And so you send it to FDLE. How do they figure out this whole family tree? Because it doesn't just tell you, all right, this is the person who did it. It's a little more complicated than that. Eventually, like you said, it gives you sort of a tree.
So there's two databases that are used. There's GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. So say, for example, like I did my own DNA through Ancestry, and I can see my family tree tells you where you're from and all those kind of stuff. I've met millions and millions of people have done it throughout the world. It's pretty cool. But what the people who are really enthusiastic about their family trees get into the GEDmatch is one of the big ones. So you take your DNA information from Ancestry, basically download it into an electronic file. So it's just a bunch of numbers and letters that are uninterpretable to me.
Yeah.
And then you upload that into GEDmatch. You have to create a separate GEDmatch account, and then you upload that data file into GEDmatch, and you opt in to allow law enforcement to search your database, or your profile. So what happened is that somewhere in our suspect's family line, somewhere somebody was related to him, went through that effort, and there's hundreds of thousands of people that have opted into the database because from somebody who wants to determine their ancestry, they're really interested in that. Or they just want to opt in because for a number of reasons. Maybe you have a family member that's gone missing, and if law enforcement, like in our cases, will submit our unidentified human remains genealogy into the database. So there's a hope that maybe, just maybe, somebody will, a loved one will be found. And there's all kinds of different reasons people do that. And I did it myself. I opted in. And I would suggest to the listeners to definitely opt in to the JED match.
Yeah.
If they have an ancestry or if they've done it, opt into the JED match. And it could help a victim. It could help somebody somewhere. You may have a long distant relative who did something, either went missing and was murdered, and remains are somewhere and who knows where. But that's basically how it works. And then once that profile gets uploaded in JED match, then a group of genealogists take a look at that, and they start narrowing down what kind of relationships that unknown offender has with known people in the database.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you, Detective Savelli, so do you get a phone call from FDLE and says, look, like we tested this blood, we or DNA, this sample, we got something back, we got these two parents, mom and dad, and it could be anybody. Like, how did that work? Did you just get a phone call or an email or what?
Yeah, it was a phone call. And you get I got a phone call and kind of explained that how they backtraced, and what's important to do is you want to get matches on both sides, on both your mom and your dad, and then where they intersect. So for instance, if there were just a family member from one side, it'd be a lot difficult, but in this instance we had matches. We had distant relatives on both the paternal and the maternal side, and then you can see where they interact. And so we knew that the DNA more than likely belonged to somebody that was birthed from two people.
Yeah, and it turned out to be one of three siblings, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And so talk about that a little bit. So you get this data back. They say, okay, here's mom, here's dad, here's three kids. Like, how do you kind of go from there? Because now, you've gone from billions of people in the world that it could possibly be down to maybe three. Mm-hmm. But obviously, you don't want to go after the wrong person. You want to make sure you're sort of focusing in on the right one. How do you determine that? What do you just keep the investigation going?
Yeah, so we use a little bit of common sense, and we kind of just looked, and we kind of looked into each history, and we kind of tried to see where they were living at the time back in '96. We looked at the age gaps. We thought in this instance, and we ended up being right, that the person that was closer in age to Terry was probably a good place to start.
And we should say right now, his name is Kenneth Stow. And this is the person that you started looking at and saying, all right, this might be the person who did this.
Yeah, in fact, we thought at the time, and there's some more stuff coming out that we really can't talk about at this point, but we thought at the time that he lived close by, or at least had some ties there. And Kenneth Stow was a long-term resident of Orange County, grew up in the Lockhart area, which was Lockhart was the neighborhood where the Lil Champ was. And he also had some previous address history there. Uh-huh. And he was closer in age, right? Mm-hmm. He was, between the three brothers. And so we just thought that was a place to start. It also kind of helped that Kenneth Stow was also living in the Central Florida area at the time, and so logistically it made sense to start there. So
you think it's Kenneth, you're going off that hunch, you're looking at his history, but then you find out that he still lives nearby, correct?
Yeah, about 25-minute drive. I've made that drive quite a bit now, but yeah, he lived in downtown Eustis, which is in Lake County, so just the county to the north of us.
Yeah, and so between sort of finding out who it might be and starting to look into him, did it take weeks, months, days? What's that sort of process like?
Oh, what did you say, Dave? A couple weeks? A lot of phone calls?
In terms of finding his DNA, is that what you're getting?
I guess okay, we think it's Kenneth, but now we need to sort of figure out if it really is. Do you just watch him for a while, or? Right, exactly.
He was put under surveillance and get a pattern of life. Figure out where he lives, where he works, what he does with his days, and our tactical teams went up there. Of course, Lake County Sheriff's Office was instrumental in helping with that. Worked great with Lake County. I really can't give them enough credit here. But they, we put them under surveillance, and we're just looking for him to get rid of some of his DNA. Whether he goes to, it's so hard to not get rid of your DNA. Whether you go out to eat or spit in the parking lot or take a drink out of it. Maybe you're getting our DNA off this wonderful water that you.
I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. I have some water here in the podcast, so you don't get parched.
I think both of us are. We're already in the database,
That's
so
true.
we're good. Yeah.
That's true. So when you're sort of watching him and sort of seeing, is there anything you learned about him? I mean, did he just live up in Eustis and had a job and just sort of kept under the radar for 25 years? Or
he had some minor criminal history, nothing that was obviously would have made him eligible for the CODIS database. But he definitely he would spend time at convenience stores, buying lotto tickets, having a beverage now and then, but nothing really that jumped out. It kind of, as you watch him, you're like, okay, I see why this guy is not in the database. He just doesn't really, just kind of didn't live a very exciting life, that's for sure. Just work and home. We'll say that the guy worked a lot. So that was. And then Detective Savelli struck gold one day.
Yeah.
And,
so tell me about this. So now that you think it's this person, but you need to sort of make a positive match, I guess. So how does that work? I mean, you don't just go up to him and say, "Hey, man, can you just swab your mouth real quick, and we're gonna go take it back and see if you're part of this homicide or not, or how does that work?"
That was in my car, and he just strolled into the Citgo one day, like every other day. And so he starts leaving. And so I'm like, I'll have to come back tomorrow. Well, he doesn't leave. He backs up to the public dumpster there, and he gets out of his car, and he throws in a bag of beer cans. It's just a grocery bag that you would get from Publix. It's a plastic bag, and he throws it in there. And then he leaves. And I was pretty close by, and I could see the bag that he threw in. And as soon as he left, I made sure he got out of the area. And I went and secured the dumpster and found the bag. And lo and behold, we found 7 beer cans and we found his lotto tickets. And so we were pretty confident at that point that we had him.
And so before I get to that part, like during this whole surveillance and even grabbing the beer cans, like, can you just do that, or do you need like a judge's sign off on it, or how does that work?
No, it's garbage.
Okay.
Throw it in the garbage. No different than if you were to, go pick up someone's garbage. Garbage is garbage.
Okay.
And so, we picked up his garbage because clearly he didn't want it. He threw it out, and so we were more than happy to take his beer cans at that point.
And so where do you take them then? What do you do with used beer cans?
Yeah, so we're lucky enough to have a forensics lab downstairs, and there's always somebody in the office, so we were able to bring them down here, and we were to store them and log them into evidence, and at that point, it was really in the hands of, like he mentioned earlier, Vanessa Nylander, who was helping us out on the case, and really up to her to process these beer cans and get the process evidence over to FDLE.
And so they take the beer cans, they swab them. I think they swab all of them, I assume, and then they hope they get a match on one of them or something on one of them.
Yeah, I don't. They swabbed each individually, and then we got a hit on one of them.
And so then what? I mean, you have a match now. I mean, does that mean you can go and arrest Kenneth?
Well, through this entire process, we work with the state attorney's office. So we have a prosecutor on board. I think the prosecution was brought on board maybe 6 or 8 months ago.
Probably longer than that.
And then so they're in lockstep with us because obviously we. As we're getting more in tune to these cold cases and we're having a much higher investigation rate on cold cases and solve rates, the state attorneys also have a bit of a learning curve as well. So now we have a system in place where we go through one prosecutor, who's actually the chief prosecutor, with all of our cold cases. So we have a pretty comprehensive review. Brian did a evidence review, put every piece of evidence in this case at our evidence section with the prosecutor. So it's not like you're just dropping a 25-year-old cold case on some prosecutor's desk and then so it's a really truly a team effort that went into this. So by the time the prosecutor reads the reports and signs off on it, there's no surprises to anybody except for the defendant.
Yeah, and so once this match was made, you could go and make an arrest.
Yeah, for the most part, yeah. And you got to imagine, we've been trying to identify this blood for 25 years, and I've only dealt with it for the past 2 years, but
that's still a long time, though.
Yeah, the other detectives, and so when we got that match, it was pretty crazy, because now we just narrowed it down to almost, I don't know how many people are in the U.S., but we were able to match it to one. I think that's pretty cool.
No, it's very, very cool. It's very, very interesting too. And so he was arrested, I think, in early November, if I'm not mistaken.
November 2nd.
November 2nd. And so I assume he's still in Orange County Jail, waiting trial, all that stuff, and
Right.
whatever happens with that case. But and we did a press event, I think, the next day or that day. And the sad part of this story is Terry, he really didn't have much family that could sort of get some solace in this.
Yeah, his mom had passed away, and he had an uncle that lived down here in Orlando that at the time was kind of the one that took lead on getting all his possessions, but he had since passed away too.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't have any brothers and sisters. I think he's got a couple distant cousins that I think one's actually in prison. And so just really no immediate family. Of course, he had his friends, and over the past 2 years, we've talked to his close friends. So we were able to call them and let them know, and they were pretty relieved.
Okay. All right. So I've asked this question before. I think I've asked both of you this question on separate occasions for different stories that I've done. Like why go after these cases? 25 years have passed. Terry has no family. Why do you continue going after these cold cases like this?
Well, it's a matter of resolution for people. It's something that there's no statute of limitations on murder, so we're going to continue to work these cases. Cold cases mean a lot to people. I as the supervisor of the cold case team, I field so many calls from people, family members wanting to know, hey, my family members were murdered. And in Terry's case, nobody was calling. It was not, but his life was no less important than anybody else's. Mm-hmm. So we're just limited really by our manpower and our resources, and moving forward, we're really excited about the lights have been shown on the cold case progress, and there's definitely some momentum that's been gained, and the sheriff himself is invested in making sure this cold case team and this process moves forward, and it's bore results. Even though Brian is technically not part of the cold case team, everybody in homicide is one giant team. Mm-hmm. And we're shorthanded in cold case. I don't have a full squad, so I'm more than happy to, and detectives want to work a case. Many of them will come up to me and say, hey, I'd like to check something out. And I'm happy to work with them and have everybody work together up there.
So, Detective Savelli, what did you learn during this process? Had you ever done anything like this before, look into cold cases that were this old, or what did you learn?
Yeah, no, I haven't. This is my. I have looked into a couple different cold cases, but I learned a lot about DNA. I learned a lot about just because you analyze DNA one way, there's different analysis that can be done on DNA. I learned a ton about family tree. I learned a ton about how much DNA people share with one another. And I also know a little bit about that just because I'm in the database as well. And so my family's big on my sister and my mom. They do their family tree. And so I knew a little bit about that. But it's just crazy how, just building someone's family tree and to think that somebody that doesn't even know Kenneth Stow is somehow related. So when we talk about the family, this person that might have connected in the database probably doesn't even know who this person is. Mm. It's probably fourth or fifth generation back. Probably had never had. It's not like they're having Thanksgiving dinner. They're so far distantly removed from the family that it's crazy to think that in this day and age we'd be able to make a connection.
Was Kenneth Stow quite surprised when you showed up on his doorstep?
I don't know. Looking back on it now that I had a chance to review the interview actually this weekend, doing some paperwork. I don't think he was that surprised because, of course, and I'll just say for the listeners, he did not confess. Mm-hmm. He did not confess to the crime, but we did learn through the interview that he did say he worked at the Lil Champ.
Okay, so he might have known how things operated.
Well, going back to the trap camera, right? Why that wasn't activated, I guess one could assume.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure you've talked about this with some of your other detectives or people that, you do something and then 25 years later you think maybe you got away with it, but then maybe you're always thinking, tomorrow might be the day that they figure this thing out.
Well, he had to know that he hurt himself in the store and his blood was left at the scene. It was in a number of places. It was commingled with the victim's blood. And anybody who watches any of these investigation shows, and I think it was one of the things that CeCe Moore, I think, had her own TV show, and I think in the back of his head he was probably thinking, "Uh-oh." Was he surprised? I don't know. He had to know it was coming one day.
But I think it's maybe a good warning to anybody else out there that might have done something like this, that there's teams like our cold case unit and even our whole homicide squad.
Sure.
They're constantly working on these things to help maybe bring some justice to family members that have lost loved ones.
Yeah, please come turn yourself in to the lobby.
And sure, it doesn't work like that very often.
We'll just skip this whole cumbersome process and just that would be fantastic.
Well, thank you guys so much for sharing, and we'll keep updating this as things maybe happen and progress. But thank you so much for chatting with me here on Behind the Star.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to Behind the Star. You can find us wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Also, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time, I'm Jon Busdeker, and this is Behind the Star.